I recently made a website so it's easier to find my builds in a written fashion. If this interests you, check out cloudland.space, linked in the description. Hey everyone, welcome back to another Cloudisms video. In this video, I wanted to talk about the Conditional Finality Exotic Raid Shotgun. This shotgun is absolutely incredible without even needing to build into it. It is so freaking strong. I pray that my viewers are lucky enough to experience the sheer power of this weapon. So, despite not needing to really build into it, this shotgun has some amazing synergies with Subclasses 3.0, and you can make this exotic insanely fun if you really play into it. The goal for this build is to heavily build into both barrels of the weapon, the freeze and the ignition, and I think the Hunter is going to be the strongest class for accomplishing this specific task, thanks to Aether's Embrace. You can do similar things with Syntho Bong Titans and Winter's Gale Warlocks, but Hunter has the easiest setup and highest fun factor for me personally. With that being said, let's jump into the build. Alrighty, so the focal point of this build is of course Conditional Finality. This weapon synergizes very well with Solar and Stasis subclasses, but I think you're going to get the most benefit out of running this weapon on Solar subclasses, with an exception being the Stasis Warlock. Ignitions have way more versatility and potency alongside huge ability regeneration options. Of course, you can also run Radiant, which provides a 20% empowerment to the weapon. This benefit alone is enough for me to always want to run this weapon on Solar. Because of this, we are going for an ignition-based build today. You might be surprised to hear that we are actually opting into running Gunpowder Gamble, despite its heavy drawback of only granting one fragment slot. Now, Gunpowder Gamble is kind of a questionable pick on Gunslinger because the other two options are just so good. But I do feel like it is the most cohesive aspect selection for building around this weapon. Now, if we talk about it really quick, I'm going to keep this short so I'm not boring you guys, but basically the reason I went with Gunpowder Gamble rather than On Your Mark here, even though we would get 2 more fragment slots, I felt that the guaranteed ignition was just way better for keeping my abilities up. And the reason for that is because of Ember of Blistering. Now, of course, you can run On Your Mark and Thermite Grenade with Weighted Knife and get pretty consistent ignitions, but I wanted an ignition spam build, and that is exactly why we chose Gunpowder Gamble. Now, only having 2 fragment slots to choose between is pretty difficult. You have to select Ember of Torches, so you're benefiting from Knock 'em Down, so you only get 2 choices. Now, the obvious choice here is going to be Ember of Eruption, just so you can bump your Gunpowder Gamble and your Conditional Finality Shotgun. This will give your ignitions 50% increased AoE, which is obviously really good. Now, the choice you might struggle with here is the second option. So I go with Ember of Blistering, simply because your ignitions grant grenade energy, which means my Gunpowder Gamble and my shotgun will be giving me grenade energy out the wazoo. That saves me a couple mod selections on my armor, meaning I can spec a little bit more into melee regen or class ability regen rather than going strictly for grenade regen. You are going to want to have a really high uptime on your thermite grenades, just so you can be constantly igniting with your weighted throwing knife. And if you didn't know, weighted throwing knife will ignite any enemy that has scorch stacks applied to him, no matter how many scorch stacks it is. So it's an awesome pairing to have these two together, because you can ignite once with the thermite grenade, and then it will scorch them again after you ignite them the first time, and then you can just dodge, get your knife back, and ignite them again. So it's really cool synergy, and if I am running weighted throwing knife, I'm always running thermite grenade. Okay, so what else might you want to slot here instead of Ember of Blistering? Now, the only other selection that I think you would find valuable is going to be slotting Ember of Char combined with Ember of Searing. Now, this is going to give you a bunch more melee energy just by spreading ignitions, and you're going to want to use this with an incandescent weapon as well. You'll be scorching an absolute ton of enemies thanks to your Gunpowder Gamble and now spreading Scorch, and also any other source of ignition you have like Conditional Finality or your Weighted Throwing Knife will also spread Scorch to affected targets. What that means is you'll be getting a ton of melee energy, so if you do whiff a knife, you can easily get it back just by defeating those scorched targets. It also creates a fire sprite, so it is going to help you with your grenade energy as long as you're picking them up. So it does kind of synergize, but I do feel as if the other setup is better, just because you'll be having that larger AoE on your ignitions, and I feel like that is extremely valuable, at least for my playstyle. So with that recommendation, like I said, if you do want to run these 2 mods, make sure you are running an incandescent weapon to make sure you're getting full value out of Ember of Searing. But these are the 2 setups I would recommend, either Char and Searing or Blistering and Eruption. Up to you what you would like to pick. Okay, so the weapon. I'm not going to go too into detail on how this weapon is going to work, but I am going to talk about how it's going to work with this build. So the first shot you have with this weapon is going to be a stasis shot. If you see, if I click, it's going to shoot my little stasis crystal out. And if I hit the enemy with it, it'll completely freeze the enemy. Now, this is the only subclass that I think takes advantage of both of these options, because the freeze synergizes excellently with Aethrus's Embrace exotic arm on the Hunter, where your weighted throwing knife is going to be dealing insane damage to frozen targets that aren't boss targets. So this won't work on bosses, this only works on rank and file and elite enemies. So that does include champions, and this is the main purpose I use this build for, is to just delete champions, but it will not work on boss enemies. So I've got an example here to show you just the difference between just the Aethrus strengthened knife and the benefit that using your knife on a frozen target grants you. As you can see, since this is an elite tier enemy, this is going to do over double damage. And the second shot you get is your solar shot. So if I shoot this, you'll see the solar goes away, and then I have both shots again. When you shoot the solar shot and you land most of your pellets, it will instantly ignite the targets. Now, this is going to give you a bunch of grenade energy for each target that you defeat with your ignition, and it's going to be a big old boom thanks to your subclass selections. So that is the synergy with this weapon. As I said earlier, you can see how this really synergizes the best with this subclass, because you're taking advantage of both barrels rather than just one and speccing hard into it like you would on like a Stasis Warlock. But that's the idea behind this build. You're really taking advantage of both thanks to Aethrus's. With the subclass out of the way, let's talk about the mods. So on your helmet, there's only one mod that really matters the most here, and that is going to be hands-on. Now, Harmonic Siphon or Solar Siphon is going to allow your conditional finality to generate orbs. Conditional finality is coded really strangely, where even your stasis shot is going to count as solar weapon final blows, as far as siphon mods are concerned. Since I have a high discipline stat, I like to slot ashes to assets, but if you are just a legend at landing your knives, you might just want to slot 2 hands-on mods here. The gloves are going to be the most important mod selections for this build. The first guaranteed always slot this mod is going to be heavy-handed. You're going to be creating orbs of power on throwing knife final blows. And these actually work consecutively. There is no internal cooldown or anything on it. You can just keep on spamming throwing knife final blows, and every single final blow will generate an orb of power. So it's really awesome for orb generation. So the mod that makes the most sense to me in this first slot is going to be Impact Induction. So Impact Induction is going to grant you grenade energy whenever you deal damage with a melee attack. It doesn't even have to be a final blow. So this is really great since you're going to have a really high uptime on your throwing knife, especially if you're landing them and defeating enemies with them. You'll just be getting a ton of grenade energy pretty much on demand with this build. This is going to make it super consistent to chain ignitions with your thermites and weighted throwing knife combo, and it's going to be awesome for just outputting a ton of damage with your grenade. The next mod is going to be the most objective choice here. You're either going to want Bolstering Detonation or Momentum Transfer. Now, if you can hit 100 strength, I think you're going to find a lot more value out of Momentum Transfer. This will make your melee cooldown a lot more reliable, since causing damage with a grenade will grant you big chunks of melee energy, and you'll be able to shorten that melee cooldown substantially. This is the best case scenario for this build, since you can rely on 2 separate ways to get your knife back, just its base cooldown and dodge. For my setup, I use Bolstering Detonation since I have a garbage strength stat. I rely solely on my dodge to get my melee back, since the dodge cooldown is way shorter. Bolstering Detonation makes this cooldown even shorter, and in pinch scenarios where I don't have my dodge or my throwing knife, I can easily fuel my dodge cooldown thanks to my high discipline stat. So this one makes the most sense in my particular playstyle. The next slot that matters is going to be your boots. So I personally feel as if recuperation is going to be an always slot this pick, just because it adds so much consistency and survivability to the build. Since you're making so many orbs, each enemy you defeat with your throwing knife is basically a free health pack laying on the ground. This is super awesome for orb of power focused builds such as this one, and I highly recommend you slot recuperation. Surge mods are going to be very interesting on this build because the conditional finality only benefits from stasis weapon surge. Even the solar shot only benefits from stasis weapon surge. So if you do want to buff the damage on conditional finality, which I recommend you should go for a stasis weapon surge. Now, the beautiful thing about the weapon surge is that it even stacks on the ignition damage on conditional finality. So whenever you have a stasis weapon surge and you shoot your solar shot to ignite an enemy, you'll be doing 10% increased ignition damage. It's really, really nice. For my playstyle, I like to slot a solar weapon surge in this final slot just to bump my add clear weapons, and in this case I'm using a solar heavy as well. But this is definitely the least important mod for this build. You can slot this out for more ability regen mods if you'd like. The best selection would probably be Innervation, since a lot of the time you won't get any benefit from Invigoration or Insulation. Optionally, you can slot Absolution. Absolution is a great all-around perk, since on occasion you might be out of both melee and dodge cooldown, and this will just give you nice little small bits of ability energy upon pick. Finally, on the class item, I like to slot 2 bombers just to get even more grenade cooldown. You probably will be using your dodge often just to get your melee back, so these will slot really nicely, just grabbing you a big chunk of grenade energy upon dodging. You should slot at least 1 time dilation here, but you can absolutely run multiple of these if you are running out of armor charges. Font of Restoration, 1-2 Finisher, and Reaper also synergize very well with this build. Feel free to experiment with each of these and decide which benefits you the most. Now, as far as weapons go, the obvious pair for this build is going to be the BXR 55 Battler. You can get this from Dares of Eternity, and it is craftable, however, it might take you a little while to grind enough keys for it. But the best perks setup is going to be in the first slot. You're probably going to want Pugilist or Demo. Pugilist makes the most sense to me, as it is going to be directly refunding you melee energy. You get 10% per defeat. This is going to be awesome for users with high strength, because you can really rely on that strength cooldown without really needing to worry about dodging too often. In the second slot, there's 2 perks that are going to really stand out here. One, Execution Rounds is going to be a great slot if you are cognizant of using the perk often. This perk is perfect for people who are great at abusing the weighted throwing knife ignition chaining, and it synergizes perfectly with Aethris's Embrace. Your BXR perk will do 500% more damage on your first burst after melee damage, but it does have a 4-second cooldown, so it's not the best perk in the world. It is a bit niche, and you really have to play into it, so the other perk that you might want to go with is Incandescent. This is the absolute must pick for people that are running Emperor of Searing with Ember of Char, because you're going to be generating so much melee energy when you combine Pugilist with Ember of Searing. It is going to be fantastic, and this is going to be perfect for people who are relying heavily on that strength stat. So go with whichever sounds more fun to you. Personally, I like the Blunt Execution Rounds just because it's a little gimmicky and it's fun to mess around with it, but please choose your favorite in this slot. As far as your heavy goes, honestly, you can use anything. I just run a GL with Spike just for the heck of it, but honestly, you could slot whatever weapon you'd like. Just make sure you're matching your surge damage. If you do run a Stasis Heavy, you could technically take off that Solar Weapon Surge if you're using it and double up on Stasis Weapon Surge, but I'll leave that ball in your part to figure out what you'd like to do. That just about wraps up the build. Hopefully it looks interesting. This is honestly some of the most fun I've had, just because there's so many moving pieces and parts to juggle, and it does massive, massive damage with just special ammo and a throwing knife cooldown. It is so much fun. Highly recommend you guys try it out, and if you are enjoying it, please let me know in the comments. I would love to see what you guys have to say. Thanks so much for watching. Bye-bye.